The November rain hammered against the tall windows of the Hartwell mansion, like thousands of tiny fingers desperately trying to get inside. Sophie Mitchell moved through the marble hallways, with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her cleaning cart wheels barely whispered against the polished floor as she pushed it toward the library on the mansion's second floor. She had been working here for 8 months now. 8 months of arriving before dawn, leaving after dusk, and existing in the spaces between the lives of people who would never truly see her. Sophie didn't mind. Invisibility had become her comfort zone, a shield she had built carefully over the past 3 years since Jacob died. The library smelled of old leather and expensive wood polish. Sophie began her routine with mechanical precision, dusting the endless rows of books that probably nobody ever read. Her reflection caught in one of the windows. A thin woman of 26 with mousy brown hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing the standard gray uniform that made her blend into the shadows, exactly how she preferred it. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the vast gardens below, currently being punished by the storm. Seattle's autumn weather showed no mercy. The trees bent under the wind's assault, their leaves scattered across the manicured lawns like abandoned pieces of a puzzle. Sophie was wiping down a mahogany desk when she heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, purposeful footsteps. Her heart rate quickened instinctively. She recognized that particular rhythm, Alexander Hartwell himself. She had seen the billionaire tech mogul only a handful of times in 8 months, always from a distance. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. Tall, probably in his mid-30s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they touched. The staff whispered about him constantly. Cold as ice, the cook Mrs. Patterson would say. Hasn't smiled since his wife died, the gardener would add sadly. The footsteps passed by the library without stopping. Sophie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She finished the library quickly and moved on to the next room, then the next. The mansion had 42 rooms, though only a fraction were actually used. It was a beautiful prison of wealth and loneliness. By mid-afternoon, Sophie had worked her way down to the main floor. She was cleaning the grand foyer when Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen, her round face creased with concern. "Sophie, dear, have you seen little Isabella today?" the older woman asked, wringing her hands on her apron. Sophie shook her head. She had never actually met Alexander Hartwell's daughter, though she had heard plenty about the 7-year-old girl. Isabella was deaf, born during a complicated delivery that had claimed her mother's life. The tragedy had apparently transformed Alexander from a charismatic entrepreneur into the ghost of a man who buried himself in work and avoided human connection. "That's the third nanny this month who's quit," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice dropping to a whisper even though they were alone. "Poor child. Mr. Hartwell tries, bless him, but he works such terrible hours. And none of these fancy nannies he hires seem to last more than a few weeks. They don't understand her, you see. They treat her like she's broken." Sophie felt a familiar ache in her chest. She understood more than Mrs. Patterson could possibly know. Jacob's face flashed through her mind, his bright smile, his flying fingers forming words in the air between them. Her twin brother had been her entire world until cancer had stolen him away 3 years ago. They had developed their own language long before either of them learned ASL properly. A secret code of gestures and expressions that only they understood. "I'm sure Mr. Hartwell will find someone," Sophie said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Patterson sighed heavily. "I hope so, dear. That little girl needs someone who sees her, not just her disability." She shuffled back toward the kitchen, muttering about dinner preparations. Sophie continued her work, but Mrs. Patterson's words lingered in her mind like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. She was polishing the grand staircase's banister when she heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist in a house this quiet. Crying. Not the normal crying of a hurt child, but the particular desperate sobbing of someone who had learned that crying rarely brought comfort. Sophie's professional instinct was to ignore it, to remain invisible, to let the family handle their own problems. But something stronger pulled at her. A memory of Jacob crying in the night after kids at school had mocked him. She followed the sound through the conservatory and out into the covered section of the garden. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, leaving everything glistening and gray. And there, sitting on a stone bench beneath a rose arbor, was a small figure in a yellow raincoat. Sophie approached slowly, her heart pounding. The child hadn't heard her, of course. She was curled into herself, face buried in her knees, small shoulders shaking with sobs. Sophie could see expensive toys scattered around the bench. A tablet, some dolls, an elaborate dollhouse, all abandoned. For a long moment, Sophie stood frozen, battling with herself. This wasn't her place. This wasn't her business. She should turn around, go back inside, remain invisible like always. But then the little girl looked up, and Sophie saw her face. Isabella Hartwell had her father's sharp features softened by childhood, but her eyes were entirely her own, large, expressive, and currently swimming with tears. Dark curls escaped from beneath her hood, plastered to her wet cheeks. She looked at Sophie with the wariness of a wounded animal who had learned not to trust easily. Without thinking, without planning, Sophie's hands began to move. "Why are you crying?" her fingers asked in ASL, the movements as natural to her as breathing. Isabella's eyes went wide. She sat up straight, tears momentarily forgotten, staring at Sophie's hands like they were performing magic. For several heartbeats, the child didn't respond, just watched with an intensity that made Sophie suddenly self-conscious. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Isabella's small hands moved. "You can talk to me." Sophie felt tears prick her own eyes. She moved closer and sat down on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. "Yes," she signed. "I can talk to you. My name is Sophie. What's your name?" "Isabella," the girl signed, then added with the brutal honesty of children, "But nobody here really talks to me. They talk at me but not to me. There's a difference." The statement hit Sophie like a physical blow. She knew exactly what Isabella meant. After Jacob died, people had talked at her constantly, offering platitudes and empty comfort, but nobody had really talked to her. Nobody had really seen her grief. "I understand," Sophie signed. "That must feel very lonely." Isabella's face crumpled and fresh tears began to fall. But this time when Sophie opened her arms, the little girl crashed into them, holding on like Sophie was a life raft in a storm. They sat there in the gray afternoon, the rain beginning to pick up again. Two people who understood what it meant to be alone in a crowded world. Sophie gently brushed the wet curls from Isabella's face. "Why were you crying?" She signed again when the girl had calmed enough to look at her. Isabella's hands moved jerkily, emotion making her signing less fluid. Another nanny left. The third one. "They always leave. They smile at Daddy and pretend to be nice, but they hate talking to me. They make mistakes and get frustrated and treat me like I'm stupid. I'm not stupid." "No," Sophie signed firmly. "You are definitely not stupid. You're very smart and very brave." "I'm not brave," Isabella signed back, shaking her head. "Brave people aren't scared all the time." Sophie felt her heart break a little more. She lifted Isabella's chin gently. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and still getting up every day. Still trying. Still hoping. That's what makes you brave." Isabella studied her face for a long moment, then signed. "You're nice. Are you going to leave too?" "I work here," Sophie signed. "I clean the house. I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" Isabella's small hands formed the word with desperate hope. Sophie knew she shouldn't make promises she might not be able to keep, but looking into those eyes, she couldn't help herself. "Promise." For the first time since Sophie had found her, Isabella smiled. It was small, tentative, like a flower trying to bloom in winter, but it was real. "Can you teach me a new sign?" Isabella asked, her enthusiasm growing. "The nannies only know basic stuff, kid stuff. I want to learn everything." Sophie felt herself smiling back, the first genuine smile she'd worn in longer than she could remember. "Of course. What do you want to learn?" They spent the next 20 minutes in the garden, Sophie teaching Isabella more advanced signs, explaining nuances and regional variations, sharing stories about Jacob and how they had communicated. Isabella soaked it all up like a sponge, her mind quick and hungry for connection. Neither of them noticed the man standing in the conservatory doorway, watching through the glass. Alexander Hartwell had come home early for once, intending to find his daughter's latest nanny and have yet another uncomfortable conversation about why the position wasn't working out. Instead, he had found Mrs. Patterson in tears, explaining that Nanny Caroline had left without even saying goodbye to Isabella. He had been searching for his daughter when he heard something that stopped him cold: Isabella's laugh. He couldn't hear it the way others could, but he had learned to recognize the visual cues, the way her shoulders shook, the expression of pure joy on her face. And now he stood frozen, watching his daughter communicate fluently with a woman he had never seen before. A woman in a cleaning uniform who was signing with professional expertise, her face animated, her whole body engaged in the conversation. Isabella looked happier than Alexander had seen her in months, maybe years. Who was this woman? As if sensing his presence, the woman looked up suddenly, her eyes meeting his through the glass. Even from this distance, he could see the color drain from her face. She said something to Isabella and stood up quickly, her body language screaming retreat. But Isabella grabbed her hand, refusing to let go. Alexander made a decision. He pushed open the conservatory door and walked out into the garden. The drizzle immediately began soaking his expensive suit, but he ignored it. Both of them turned to look at him. His daughter's expression was anxious, protective. The woman looked terrified, like she expected to be fired on the spot. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, I was just—" He held up a hand, stopping her. His eyes moved to his daughter. "Isabella, go inside with Mrs. Patterson. I need to speak with—" He trailed off, realizing he didn't know the woman's name. "Sophie Mitchell, sir," she supplied, her voice shaking. "I'm one of the housekeepers." "Go inside, Isabella," he repeated gently. His daughter's hands moved quickly, signing something to Sophie. The woman signed back, and whatever she said made Isabella nod reluctantly. The child gave Alexander a worried look, then ran toward the house, leaving them alone in the garden. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft patter of rain. Alexander studied the woman before him. She kept her eyes down, her posture screaming submission and fear, but her hands, he noticed, were steady, strong. "How long have you worked here?" he asked finally. 8 months, sir. And in 8 months, nobody thought to mention that we had an employee who was fluent in ASL. She flinched at his tone. Nobody asked, sir. It wasn't relevant to my position." "Not relevant?" His voice rose slightly, and he saw her shrink back. He forced himself to take a breath to modulate his tone. "This wasn't her fault. I've spent the last 7 years hiring specialist after specialist, nanny after nanny, trying to find someone who could really connect with my daughter. Do you have any idea how much I've spent? How many so-called experts have walked through these doors?" "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. "Stop apologizing," he said, more sharply than he intended. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at myself, at the system, at the fact that the answer was here all along and I was too blind to see it." He ran a hand through his dark hair, feeling the weight of every sleepless night, every worry, every moment of helplessness as a father who couldn't communicate with his own child. "Where did you learn to sign?" he asked. "My brother," she said quietly. "My twin, Jacob. He was deaf. He died 3 years ago." The simple statement carried an ocean of grief. Alexander recognized it immediately. He had become an expert in grief. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Alexander made another decision, one that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. "Miss Mitchell, I'd like to offer you a new position." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. "Sir?" "Isabella needs someone who understands her, really understands her. Not just someone who knows sign language, but someone who sees her as a complete person, not a problem to be solved." He paused, watching emotions flicker across her face. "I'm offering you the position of Isabella's companion and educator. The salary would be—" "I can't," she interrupted, then immediately looked horrified at having cut him off. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't. I'm just a housekeeper. I don't have credentials or degrees. Your daughter deserves better than—" "My daughter deserves someone who will make her laugh like that," Alexander interrupted right back. "Someone who will sit with her in the rain and treat her like a person. Everything else we can figure out." Sophie shook her head, panic clear on her face. "Mr. Hartwell, with all respect, you don't know anything about me. I know you made my daughter smile for the first time in 3 months," he said quietly. "That's enough for me." The rain was falling harder now, but neither of them moved. They stood there in the garden, 2 broken people circling around a decision that terrified them both. "I need time to think," Sophie finally said. Alexander nodded slowly. "Take tonight. Give me your answer tomorrow morning." He started to walk away, then turned back. "And Miss Mitchell, thank you for being kind to her, for seeing her." He walked back into the house, leaving Sophie standing alone in the rain. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had bridged a gap she hadn't even known existed. Jacob's voice echoed in her memory. "Your hands have magic in them, Sophie. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Tomorrow. She had until tomorrow to decide whether to step out of the shadows and into a life that terrified her. In the house, Alexander stood at his office window, watching the rain. For the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten how to name: hope. Sophie didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small studio apartment in Capitol Hill, staring at the water-stained ceiling as Seattle's rain drummed against the window. The space was tiny, barely 400 square feet, but it was hers. Safe, predictable. Everything in her life had been carefully constructed to avoid risk, avoid pain, avoid the kind of loss that had shattered her 3 years ago. Now Alexander Hartwell was offering her something that threatened all of that. She rolled over and looked at the photo on her nightstand. Jacob grinned back at her, frozen forever at 23, his hands caught mid-sign, probably telling one of his terrible jokes. They had been inseparable from birth, two halves of the same whole. When he died, Sophie had felt like half of herself had been buried with him. "What would you do?" she whispered to the photograph, her hands signing the question even though no one could see. "Would you tell me to be brave? Or would you understand why I'm scared?" The apartment remained silent except for the rain. At 5:30 a.m., Sophie gave up on sleep. She showered, dressed in her gray uniform, and made the 40-minute bus ride to the Hartwell mansion. The early morning streets were empty, the city still sleeping under its blanket of clouds. She usually found comfort in these quiet hours, but today anxiety coiled in her stomach like a living thing. Mrs. Patterson was already in the kitchen when Sophie arrived, preparing breakfast. The older woman took one look at Sophie's face and immediately poured her a cup of coffee. "Didn't sleep, did you?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. Sophie shook her head, wrapping her cold hands around the warm mug. "How did you know?" "Mr. Hartwell called me last night, told me about his offer." Mrs. Patterson settled into a chair across from her, her weathered face kind. "He also asked me what I thought of you, your character, whether I thought you could handle the responsibility." Sophie's heart jumped. "What did you say?" "I told him the truth, that you're the most conscientious, hard-working person I've ever met, that you're punctual, thorough, and kind." Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and patted Sophie's hand. "I also told him that you've been hiding from life since your brother died, and maybe this job would be good for you. Help you remember what it's like to live instead of just exist." The words hit harder than Sophie expected. She felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this. What if I fail her? What if I make things worse? What if you don't fail?" Mrs. Patterson countered. "What if you change that little girl's life? What if you change your own?" She stood up, moving back to the stove where bacon was beginning to sizzle. "Fear is a terrible reason to say no to something good, dear." Sophie sat with those words, feeling their weight. Through the kitchen window she could see the gardens where she had found Isabella yesterday. The roses were battered from the storm, petals scattered across the wet ground, but they were still standing. At 7 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her pulse quickened. Alexander Hartwell appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking like he hadn't slept either. His hair was disheveled, his usually impeccable appearance rumpled. He wore running clothes, suggesting he'd been trying to work off his own restlessness. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice neutral. "Have you made a decision?" Sophie stood up, her legs unsteady. This was the moment, the fork in the road. She could say no, retreat back to her safe, invisible life and wonder forever what might have been. Or she could say yes and risk everything. She thought of Isabella's face when she had signed promise. She thought of Jacob, who had lived every day of his too short life with courage and joy despite the world's obstacles. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's words about hiding from life. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I'll take the position." Something shifted in Alexander Hartwell's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes, a release of tension in his shoulders. "Good. That's good." He ran a hand through his hair. "We should discuss terms. My office at 9? Sophie nodded, not trusting her voice. He started to leave, then turned back. "Isabella will be happy. She asked me about you 3 times before bed last night. She wanted to know if you were coming back." His voice dropped slightly. "She doesn't usually get attached to people that quickly. I'm not sure if that should concern me or give me hope." "Hope," Sophie said quietly. "Definitely hope." This time he did smile. It was small and rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a long time, but it was real. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Sophie's elbow, grinning broadly. "Well now, looks like things are about to get interesting around here." The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Sophie mechanically went through some of her usual cleaning routine, but her mind was spinning with implications. What would her new role actually entail? Where would she work with Isabella? What about her apartment? Her carefully structured life? At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of Alexander Hartwell's office. She had never been inside before. The housekeeping staff cleaned it when he was away on business trips. "Come in," his voice called. The office was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Walls lined with awards and photos from various tech conferences. A massive desk that looked like it cost more than Sophie's annual salary. But what caught her attention were the personal touches. A crayon drawing pinned to a corkboard. Clearly Isabella's work. A pair of tiny pink shoes on a shelf. A framed photo of a beautiful woman holding a newborn baby, both of them connected to machines in what was clearly a hospital room. Alexander noticed her looking. "My wife, Catherine. That was taken an hour before she died." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Sophie heard the ocean of pain beneath it. Isabella never got to know her. "Sometimes I wonder if that makes it easier or harder." "Harder," Sophie said softly. "Loss is hard enough. Loss of someone you never got to know is its own special kind of grief." He looked at her sharply, then nodded slowly. "Yes, exactly that." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Sophie sat on the edge of the leather chair, her posture rigid. Alexander settled behind his desk, pulling out a folder. "I had my lawyer draw up a preliminary contract last night," he said. "Obviously, we can adjust terms as needed. The salary is $85,000 annually, with full benefits and a housing allowance. You would work Monday through Friday, 8 to 6, with flexibility for special circumstances. Your role would be Isabella's educational companion and sign language specialist. We'd also hire a certified teacher to work with both of you on curriculum planning." Sophie felt dizzy. $85,000. That was more than double what she made now. She could pay off her student loans, help her mother with medical bills, actually save money. "That's very generous," she managed. "It's fair compensation for an essential role," he corrected. "Isabella is 7 years old and already falling behind academically because we can't find consistent, quality support. You would be changing that." He paused. "There is one complication we need to discuss." Sophie's stomach tightened. "What kind of complication?" Isabella's behavioral specialist recommended immersive communication support, especially during the transition period. She suggested that her primary caregiver should be present, not just during structured hours, but throughout her daily routine. He looked uncomfortable. "Which means I'm asking if you'd be willing to live here, in the mansion. We have a suite in the West Wing that would be yours, completely private, but I understand if that's too much of an imposition." "I'll do it," Sophie interrupted. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him, but somehow she knew it was right. Her apartment was just a place to hide. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Alexander's eyebrows rose. "You're sure? You don't want time to think about it?" "I've done nothing but think since yesterday," Sophie said. "If this is what Isabella needs, then yes, I'll live here." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what kind of person she really was. "Miss Mitchell, I need to be clear about something. Isabella is the most important person in my world. The only important person. I've made mistakes with her. I know that. I've let work consume me. I've hired professionals instead of being present. I'm trying to change that, but it's..." He trailed off, his jaw tight. "If you take this job, I need to know you're committed. Not just to the paycheck, but to her. She's been abandoned too many times already." Sophie felt the weight of his words, the desperation beneath the stern exterior. This wasn't just a billionaire hiring staff. This was a father drowning, reaching for a lifeline. "Mr. Hartwell, 3 years ago my brother died in my arms," she said quietly. "He was everything to me. When he was gone, I stopped living. I went through motions. I made myself invisible because being seen hurt too much." She met his eyes directly for the first time. "Yesterday when I sat with your daughter in the garden, I felt alive for the first time since Jacob died. So yes, I'm committed. Not for the money, though I won't pretend I don't need it. I'm committed because Isabella reminded me what it feels like to matter to someone." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Two people who had lost everything circling around hope like it might burn them. "Call me Alexander," he said finally. "If you're going to live here, work this closely with my family, formality seems unnecessary." Sophie nodded. "Then you should call me Sophie." He almost smiled again. "All right then, Sophie, when can you start?" "Today," she said, "if that works." This time he did smile, and Sophie realized he was younger than she had thought. The grief and stress had aged him, but underneath was a man probably not yet 40, with kind eyes and a vulnerability he tried hard to hide. "Mrs. Patterson will show you to your suite. Take today to move your things. Get settled. Tomorrow we'll sit down with Isabella and explain the new arrangement." He stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to the team, Sophie." She shook his hand. noting the strength in his grip, the calluses that suggested he did more than just sit behind a desk. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for being brave enough to say yes." The rest of the day was a whirlwind. Mrs. Patterson showed Sophie to her new suite, a beautiful 2-room space with its own bathroom, a small sitting area, and windows overlooking the rose garden. It was bigger than her entire apartment and furnished like something from a magazine. "Mr. Hartwell had it prepared last night," Mrs. Patterson explained. "He was confident you'd say yes, or maybe he was just hoping very hard." Sophie took a bus back to her apartment, packed her meager belongings into 3 suitcases, and said goodbye to a space that had been her refuge but had also become her prison. Her landlord was understanding about breaking the lease early, especially when she offered to forfeit her deposit. By evening, she was unpacking in her new room, trying to process how drastically her life had changed in 24 hours. She was hanging clothes in the massive closet when she heard a small sound behind her. Isabella stood in the doorway wearing pajamas covered in cartoon cats, her dark curls wild around her face. She looked uncertain, hopeful, and terrified all at once. Sophie's hands moved instinctively. "Hi there. Is it okay that I'm here?" Isabella's face lit up like sunrise. "You're staying?" She signed back. "I'm staying," Sophie confirmed. "Is that okay with you?" Isabella ran across the room and crashed into Sophie's legs, hugging her tight. Sophie froze for a moment, then slowly wrapped her arms around the small body. She felt the child shaking slightly and realized Isabella was crying. "What's wrong?" Sophie signed when Isabella pulled back. "I'm happy," Isabella signed, tears streaming down her face. "I've never had someone who was just for me, someone who stayed." Sophie's heart cracked open. She knelt down so they were eye to eye. "I'm not going anywhere, Isabella, I promise." "That's what they all say," Isabella signed, her small hands fierce. "The nannies, the therapists, everyone. They say they'll stay and then they leave." Sophie understood that fear in her bones. After Jacob died, she had pushed everyone away because losing people hurt too much. But Isabella couldn't push people away. She could only watch them leave, over and over again. "I'm different," Sophie signed. "You want to know why?" Isabella nodded, wiping her tears. "Because I'm not here for your father or for the money or because it's my job." Sophie touched her hand to her heart, then to Isabella's. "I'm here because when I met you yesterday, you reminded me of my brother, and because you made me remember what it feels like to care about someone. That's not something I can walk away from." Isabella studied her face intently, the way children do when they're trying to determine if adults are telling the truth. Then, apparently satisfied, she signed, "Can you teach me more signs before bed?" Sophie smiled. "Absolutely, what do you want to learn?" They spent the next hour sitting cross-legged on Sophie's new bed, practicing signs and laughing when Isabella made silly mistakes on purpose. Sophie taught her the signs for different emotions, for weather patterns, for abstract concepts like hope and courage, and friendship. Neither of them noticed Alexander standing in the hallway, watching through the partially open door. He had come to tell Isabella it was bedtime but found himself frozen by the scene before him. His daughter was engaged, animated, happy in a way he hadn't seen since she was a toddler, before she fully understood that she was different from other children. This woman, Sophie, had done in 2 days what dozens of expensive specialists had failed to do in years. She had made Isabella feel seen, valued, understood, not as a problem to be solved, but as a complete person. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a wall beginning to crack. He had built so many walls after Catherine died, fortifications against the pain and guilt and overwhelming responsibility of single parenthood. But watching Sophie sign with his daughter, seeing them both laugh at some shared joke he couldn't hear, he felt those walls starting to crumble. It terrified him. He quietly walked away before either of them noticed him, returning to his office. But instead of working, he found himself staring at Catherine's photo again. "I think I just made the right decision," he whispered to the image. "Or the most dangerous one. I'm not sure which." In Sophie's room, Isabella was yawning, fighting sleep. Sophie signed, "Time for bed, little one." "Will you be here in the morning?" Isabella signed, her eyes anxious. "I will be here in the morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that," Sophie promised. Isabella hugged her again, then padded out of the room. At the door, she turned back and signed one more thing. "I love you." Sophie's breath caught. She signed back, tears blurring her vision. "I love you too." When Isabella was gone, Sophie sat on her bed and let herself cry. Happy tears, terrified tears, tears of grief for Jacob, and hope for tomorrow. She had stepped out of the shadows and into a life that was bigger and scarier and more beautiful than anything she had imagined. Tomorrow, everything would begin for real. Outside her window, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds were breaking up, revealing stars. Sophie took it as a sign. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to believe in new beginnings. The first 2 weeks of Sophie's new position passed in a blur of structured chaos. She woke each morning in her suite, still surprised by the luxury of her surroundings, and spent her days building a routine with Isabella that felt less like work and more like discovering a missing piece of herself. Alexander had hired Dr. Rebecca Chen, an educational consultant specializing in deaf education, to help design Isabella's curriculum. Dr. Chen was a sharp woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that Sophie immediately respected. The previous nannies made a critical mistake, Dr. Chen explained during their first meeting in the mansion's converted classroom. They treated Isabella's deafness as a limitation to work around, rather than simply a different way of experiencing the world. You don't do that, Sophie. That's why this is working. Sophie sat across from her at the small table while Isabella played with educational blocks nearby, building an elaborate castle. I just treat her like my brother, like a complete person who happens to communicate differently. Exactly, Dr. Chen said. And that's revolutionary for her. She pulled out a tablet, showing Sophie assessment results. I tested Isabella's cognitive abilities yesterday. She's not behind, Sophie. She's actually ahead in several areas: spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, visual memory. She's been understimulated and underchallenged because everyone was so focused on her deafness, they forgot to educate the brilliant child underneath. The word settled over Sophie like validation. She had suspected as much from their interactions, but hearing it confirmed by an expert made her chest swell with pride for Isabella. So what's the plan? Sophie asked. Dr. Chen smiled. We challenge her. Real academics, not just basic sign language practice and coloring books. Mathematics, science, literature adapted for visual learning, creative writing and ASL, and we document everything because when it comes time for school placement next year, we need to prove she belongs in an advanced program, not a remedial one. Over the following days, Sophie threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised her. She and Isabella established a routine: mornings for structured academics, afternoons for creative exploration, evenings for casual conversation and play. The classroom became their sanctuary, filled with colorful posters, books, and Isabella's artwork. But it wasn't just Isabella who was learning. Sophie found herself researching late into the night, reading everything she could about deaf education, child psychology, and advanced teaching methods. She wanted to be worthy of the trust Alexander had placed in her, worthy of Isabella's belief that she would stay. Alexander himself remained largely absent during those first weeks, leaving for the office before breakfast and returning after Isabella's bedtime. Sophie saw him mainly in passing, a nod in the hallway, a brief question about Isabella's progress, a distracted good morning over coffee. He was polite but distant, maintaining careful boundaries. Mrs. Patterson noticed. He's scared, she told Sophie one afternoon while they prepared snacks in the kitchen. Scared of hoping things might actually work out this time. Scared of getting attached to someone who might leave. He's protecting himself. I'm not going to leave, Sophie protested. I know that. You know that. But he's been burned before. Give him time. The breakthrough came on a rainy Saturday afternoon 3 weeks into Sophie's tenure. She and Isabella were in the library, working on a creative writing project. Isabella was telling a story in sign language while Sophie transcribed it, when Alexander appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted. His tie was loose, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But his face softened when he saw Isabella, who hadn't noticed him yet, completely absorbed in her storytelling. Sophie's hands paused in their transcription. She had gotten used to Alexander's ghost-like presence in the house, but this was the first time he had actually entered a space where she and Isabella were working. Isabella finally noticed her father, and her hands stopped mid-sign. Her expression became guarded, cautious. It broke Sophie's heart to see the change, from animated and open to carefully neutral in seconds. Don't let me interrupt, Alexander said, moving into the room. I just wanted to see what you two were working on. Isabella looked at Sophie uncertainly. Sophie signed to her. It's okay, show him your story, he'll love it. Slowly, hesitantly, Isabella began signing her story again. It was about a princess who couldn't hear but could see magic and colors that other people missed. The princess went on adventures, helping people by showing them the beautiful things they overlooked because they were too busy listening to noise. As Isabella signed, Sophie spoke the translation aloud for Alexander's benefit. She watched his face transform as he understood what his daughter was creating. Not just a story, but a reflection of how she saw herself and the world. When Isabella finished, Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something Sophie hadn't seen before. He knelt down in front of his daughter, making himself small, vulnerable at her level. "That was beautiful, Isabella," he said slowly, carefully enunciating so she could read his lips. But then his hands began to move, clumsy and uncertain, but unmistakable. "Beautiful," he signed. Isabella's eyes went wide. She looked at Sophie as if seeking confirmation that she was really seeing what she thought she was seeing. Sophie nodded, her own throat tight with emotion. "You're learning?" Isabella signed to her father, her hands shaking with hope and disbelief. Alexander's signing was rough, clearly the result of recent study, but he managed. "Yes, learning. For you." Isabella launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Alexander caught her, holding on tight, his eyes squeezed shut. Over Isabella's shoulder, his gaze found Sophie's. The raw gratitude and pain and hope in his expression made her have to look away. "I've been taking lessons," Alexander said when Isabella finally pulled back. "Online courses every night after work. I'm not very good yet, but Dr. Chen is helping me. I should have done this years ago. I should have." His voice cracked slightly. Sophie stood up, giving them space. "I'll go get us some snacks," she said quietly, though she knew Isabella couldn't hear her. She signed it to Isabella instead. "I'll be right back." In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, pressing her palms to her eyes. Mrs. Patterson found her there. "Crying?" the older woman asked gently. "He's learning sign language for her," Sophie managed. "All this time I thought he didn't care enough, but he's been studying every night. He's trying, Mrs. Patterson. He's really trying." "Of course he is. He loves that girl more than life itself. He just didn't know how to show it." Mrs. Patterson handed her a tissue. "You've given him that gift, Sophie. You've shown him it's possible to reach her." When Sophie returned to the library with cookies and juice, she found Alexander and Isabella sitting together on the floor, Isabella teaching her father signs with exaggerated patience, the way children do when they're thrilled to be the expert for once. Alexander was laughing, actually laughing, at his own mistakes, and the sound was so unexpected and genuine that Sophie felt her chest tighten again. "This," she thought, "this is what a family should look like." Alexander looked up as she entered, and something in his expression had changed. The careful distance was gone, replaced by an openness that made Sophie suddenly aware of how handsome he was when he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you," he signed to her, the gesture simple but loaded with meaning. Then, in his still clumsy ASL, "You saved us." Sophie shook her head. "You saved yourselves. I just helped you find each other again." That evening, for the first time since Sophie had arrived, Alexander stayed for dinner. Mrs. Patterson nearly dropped a serving dish when he appeared in the dining room at 6 o'clock, asking if there was enough for him to join them. The meal was simultaneously awkward and wonderful. Alexander's signing was limited, so conversation was stilted, but Isabella was radiant with joy at having her father present. She told him about everything they had been learning, her hands flying so fast that Sophie had to remind her to slow down so Alexander could follow. Watching them, Sophie felt something shift inside her. For 3 years, she had believed that her capacity for family had died with Jacob, but sitting at this table, mediating between father and daughter, helping them bridge the gap that had separated them for so long, she felt that frozen part of herself beginning to thaw. After dinner, Alexander helped Isabella with her bath time routine while Sophie cleaned up the classroom. She was organizing books when Alexander appeared in the doorway, Isabella presumably tucked into bed. "She's asleep," he said, or at least pretending to be. "She made me read her 3 stories. Sophie smiled. "She's good at negotiating. She gets that from her mother." Alexander moved into the room, studying the walls covered in Isabella's artwork and educational posters. "Catherine was brilliant at getting her way. Convinced me to invest in a startup company that everyone said would fail. It became my first major success." It was the first time Sophie had heard him speak about his wife so casually, not with the heavy weight of grief, but with affectionate memory. "Dr. Chen showed me Isabella's progress reports," Alexander continued. "She's exceeding every benchmark. In just 3 weeks, you've accomplished more than we managed in the previous year. Isabella was always capable of this, Sophie said. She just needed someone to believe in her potential instead of focusing on her limitations. Alexander leaned against a desk, his posture more relaxed than Sophie had ever seen it. I've been a terrible father to her, haven't I? The blunt self-assessment shocked Sophie. No, it's okay. You don't have to be polite. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sophie was beginning to recognize as his tell when he was stressed. After Catherine died, I threw myself into work because it was easier than facing what I'd lost. And Isabella paid the price. I hired people to raise her because I was too afraid to get close. Too afraid I'd fail her the way I'd failed Catherine. You didn't fail Catherine, Sophie said quietly. Sometimes terrible things just happen. No one's to blame. The doctors said if we'd done a C-section earlier, Catherine might have survived. But she insisted on trying for natural birth. She was so determined that Isabella would enter the world the right way. His voice was rough with old pain. I should have insisted. Should have overruled her. Sophie recognized the burden he was carrying. Survivor's guilt, complicated grief, the weight of might-have-beens. She had carried similar weight after Jacob's death, all the times she hadn't visited him in the hospital, all the conversations they'd never had. I spent a year after my brother died going through every decision I'd made, Sophie said. Every time I'd been too busy to visit, every fight we'd had about stupid things. I was convinced if I'd just done something differently, he might have survived longer. She met Alexander's eyes. But my therapist finally helped me understand that guilt is just love with nowhere to go. You loved your wife. You love your daughter. The guilt is just proof of how much you care. Alexander stared at her and something vulnerable flickered across his face. How did you get so wise? 3 years of therapy and a lot of crying, Sophie said with a small smile. I'm not wise. I'm just further along in the grief process. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the space between them charged with understanding. Two people who had lost everything, finding unexpected solidarity and shared pain. I'm glad you're here, Sophie, Alexander said finally. Not just for Isabella, for all of us. Before Sophie could respond, he left the room, leaving her standing among Isabella's artwork, her heart beating faster than it should. Over the next week, the dynamic in the house shifted noticeably. Alexander began coming home earlier, joining them for dinner most nights. His sign language improved rapidly. He had always been a quick study, Sophie learned, part of what made him such a successful entrepreneur. He started participating in Isabella's bedtime routine, reading her stories with Sophie translating when his signing failed him. The staff noticed too. Haven't seen him smile this much in years, the gardener commented to Sophie one morning. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But it wasn't just Alexander who was changing. Sophie found herself laughing more, sleeping better, looking forward to each day instead of just enduring it. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, and while it scared her, it also felt like finally breathing after years of holding her breath. One evening, after Isabella was asleep, Sophie was reading in the library when Alexander found her. He held 2 glasses of wine. Peace offering, he said. I know I've been intense about work schedules and documentation. Dr. Chen told me I need to relax a bit, trust the process. Sophie accepted the wine glass, surprised. You're doing great. Being present for Isabella is more important than any schedule. Alexander settled into the chair across from her. Tell me about your brother. You've mentioned him, but I'd like to really know about him. So Sophie told him about Jacob's mischievous personality, his terrible jokes, his refusal to let his deafness define him, about their secret twin language they'd developed as children, long before they learned proper ASL, about his battle with cancer and his final words signed to her. Don't stop living just because I have to. I broke that promise for 3 years, Sophie admitted. I existed, but I didn't live. Not until Isabella crashed into my life. She has a talent for that, Alexander said with a soft smile. Crashing into people's lives and changing everything. She gets that from her father, Sophie said, then froze, realizing the implications of her words. Alexander's eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. Not just understanding anymore, but something deeper, more dangerous. Sophie, he began, but whatever he was about to say was interrupted by a crash from upstairs. They both ran to Isabella's room, finding her sitting up in bed, crying. She had knocked over her nightstand lamp reaching for her water glass, but it wasn't the lamp that had her upset. Bad dream, she signed frantically. Mama was calling me, but I couldn't hear her. I tried and tried, but I couldn't hear. Alexander gathered her into his arms while Sophie cleaned up the broken lamp. "It's okay, baby. Mama isn't angry. She loved you so much." But Isabella kept crying, inconsolable. Sophie sat on the other side of the bed and began signing a story, one she had made up for Jacob when he had nightmares, about a garden where deaf children could finally hear. But they discovered they didn't want to because the silence let them see things others missed. The way flowers breathed, the way colors sang, the way love looked when it had no sound. Slowly, Isabella calmed, watching Sophie's hands weave the story. Alexander watched too, his expression unreadable. When Isabella finally drifted back to sleep, they tiptoed out together. In the hallway, Alexander caught Sophie's hand. "That story," he said quietly. "It was perfect. You're perfect with her." Sophie's breath caught at the touch, at the intensity in his voice. "I just understand what it's like to feel different, to feel like something essential is missing." "Maybe that's why you understand her so well," Alexander said. "You both know what it's like to lose part of yourselves." He was still holding her hand. They stood in the dim hallway, the house quiet around them, and Sophie felt the axis of her world tilting again. This was dangerous territory. She worked for him. He was her employer. Isabella needed stability, not complicated adult feelings disrupting everything. But when Alexander's thumb brushed across her knuckles, gentle and questioning, Sophie didn't pull away. "This is complicated," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "but I haven't felt this alive in 7 years." The confession hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Sophie knew she should step back, maintain professional boundaries, protect herself from potential heartbreak. Instead, she squeezed his hand back. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. Outside, Seattle's rain began again, soft and steady. And in that quiet hallway, two broken people took their first tentative step toward healing together. The morning after their hallway moment, Sophie woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. She fumbled for it, squinting at the screen. 6:47 a.m. A text from an unknown number. "This is Alexander. I apologize for last night. I crossed a line. It won't happen again. We should maintain appropriate professional boundaries." Sophie stared at the message, feeling something heavy settle in her chest. Of course he regretted it. She had been foolish to think that moment meant anything beyond two lonely people seeking comfort in the dark. She was the hired help, nothing more. She typed back, "Understood. No need to apologize. Professional, distant, safe." She dressed mechanically and went downstairs where Mrs. Patterson was already preparing breakfast. The older woman took one look at Sophie's face and frowned. "What happened?" "Nothing," Sophie said, pouring herself coffee with shaking hands. "Absolutely nothing." Isabella bounded into the kitchen moments later, signing excitedly about a dream she'd had where she could fly. Sophie plastered on a smile and engaged with the child, pushing down the disappointment that threatened to swallow her whole. Alexander didn't appear for breakfast. Mrs. Patterson mentioned he'd left for an early meeting downtown and wouldn't be back until evening. Sophie told herself she was relieved. The day dragged. Sophie and Isabella worked through their lessons, but Sophie's heart wasn't in it. She kept replaying the hallway scene, Alexander's thumb on her knuckles, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious, and then that cold text message, erecting walls between them again. Dr. Chen arrived mid-morning for Isabella's weekly assessment and immediately noticed Sophie's distraction. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly, while Isabella was engrossed in a puzzle. "Fine," Sophie lied. "Just tired." Dr. Chen studied her with the penetrating gaze of someone who saw through facades for a living. "Sophie, whatever's going on, don't let it affect your work with Isabella. That child has finally found stability. She can't afford to lose it." The words hit like a slap. Dr. Chen was right. Sophie's personal feelings, whatever they were, couldn't be allowed to disrupt Isabella's progress. The girl was thriving for the first time in her life. That mattered more than Sophie's bruised ego or complicated feelings about her employer. "You're right," Sophie said. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." She threw herself back into the work with renewed focus. By afternoon, she and Isabella were working on a science project about plant growth, dirt under their fingernails, laughing as they transplanted seedlings into colorful pots. This was what mattered. This connection, this purpose, this child who had given Sophie a reason to live again. But when evening came and Alexander still hadn't returned, Sophie felt the disappointment gnaw at her again. She helped Isabella with dinner and bath time, then tucked her into bed with their usual story routine. "Where's Daddy?" Isabella signed, her face scrunched with worry. "He promised to read with me tonight." Sophie's heart ached. "He had to work late, sweetheart, but he'll be here tomorrow, I promise." "That's what the nannies always said," Isabella signed, her hands moving with increasing agitation. "And then they would leave, and Daddy would work more, and nobody would be here." Sophie pulled the child into her arms. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "And your daddy loves you so much, Isabella. Sometimes adults have to work even when they don't want to. It doesn't mean he doesn't care." But Isabella's face was skeptical, resigned in a way no 7-year-old should be. She had learned not to expect reliability from the adults in her life. After Isabella finally fell asleep, Sophie returned to her suite feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She changed into comfortable clothes and was about to call it a night when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. A soft knock. "Sophie, it's Alexander. Can we talk?" Every instinct told her to pretend she was asleep to avoid this conversation, but she opened the door anyway. Alexander looked terrible. His tie was askew, his hair disheveled, and there was something haunted in his eyes. "Can I come in? I know it's inappropriate, but I need to explain about this morning." Sophie stepped back, letting him enter. He moved to the window, staring out at the dark gardens, his shoulders tense. "I panicked," he said without preamble. "Last night in the hallway, I felt something I haven't felt since Catherine died, and it terrified me. So I did what I always do when I'm scared. I retreated. I sent that text and threw myself into work. I convinced myself it was about maintaining boundaries, protecting Isabella, being professional." He turned to face her, and the raw vulnerability in his expression made Sophie's breath catch. "But the truth is, I was protecting myself, because if I acknowledge what I'm feeling, if I let myself care about you the way I'm starting to, then I risk losing you, and I don't know if I can survive that kind of loss again." Sophie's anger dissolved, replaced by understanding. She had been doing the same thing for 3 years, hiding from connection to avoid pain. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "After Jacob died, I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone close enough to hurt me again. And then Isabella crashed into my life, and you." She trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. "And me?" Alexander prompted softly. "And you make me want to be brave again," Sophie whispered, "even though it terrifies me." The space between them felt charged, electric. Alexander took a step toward her, then stopped, clearly fighting with himself. "This is complicated," he said, echoing her words from the night before. "You work for me. Isabella depends on you. If this goes wrong, then we'll deal with it." Sophie interrupted. "But Alexander, we can't live our whole lives avoiding risk because we're afraid of pain. That's not living. That's just existing." Something shifted in his expression. "When did you get so wise? Someone recently reminded me that my brother wouldn't want me to stop living just because he had to," Sophie said with a small smile. Alexander closed the distance between them in 3 strides. He cupped her face gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he kissed her. It was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. Sophie's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself against the wave of emotion. This kiss tasted like hope and fear, and the possibility of new beginnings. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be with someone again. I'm going to mess up constantly." "So will I," Sophie said. "But maybe we can mess up together." He laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. Then his expression sobered. "Isabella has to come first. Always. If she's uncomfortable with this, if it affects her negatively in any way, then we stop," Sophie finished. "She's the priority. We agree on that." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, both marveling at the fact that they were choosing hope over fear. "I should go," Alexander said eventually. "It's late and I have an early meeting tomorrow." Sophie nodded, but neither of them moved. Finally, Alexander kissed her forehead gently and left. Sophie touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. She had crossed a line tonight, stepped off a cliff without knowing if there was ground below, but for the first time in 3 years, she was okay with that. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Sophie was helping Isabella with breakfast when the doorbell rang. Mrs. Patterson went to answer it and returned moments later with a woman Sophie had never seen before. She was impeccably dressed in a designer suit, her blonde hair styled in a perfect bob, her makeup flawless. Everything about her screamed money and social status. "Isabella, darling," the woman exclaimed, rushing toward the child with arms outstretched. Isabella's face went pale. She shrank back against Sophie, her hands signing frantically, "Grandmother, don't like fake." The woman, apparently Alexander's mother-in-law, noticed the signing and her expression tightened. "Still doing that hand-waving nonsense, I see. Alexander really needs to get you a cochlear implant, darling. You're far too old to be playing deaf and dumb." Sophie felt rage ignite in her chest. Isabella isn't playing anything. She is deaf, and sign language is a complete and sophisticated form of communication, not hand-waving nonsense. The woman's eyes swiveled to Sophie, seeing her for the first time. Her gaze raked over Sophie's casual clothes and lack of makeup with obvious disdain. "And who are you? Another nanny? They seem to come and go like seasonal help around here." "I'm Sophie Mitchell, Isabella's educational companion and sign language specialist," Sophie said, keeping her voice level despite wanting to throw this horrible woman out of the house. "Educational companion," the woman repeated with a laugh. "How precious. I'm Victoria Hartwell, Isabella's grandmother and Catherine's mother. I've come to discuss my granddaughter's future with Alexander." "Mr. Hartwell is at his office," Mrs. Patterson interjected nervously. "Perhaps you should call ahead next time, Mrs. Hartwell." "I don't need to call ahead to visit my own granddaughter," Victoria snapped. She turned back to Sophie. "I'll be frank, Miss Mitchell. Alexander has made poor decisions regarding Isabella's care for years. My daughter would be horrified to see her child being raised like some sort of charity case, learning hand gestures instead of proper speech." Sophie's hands clenched into fists. "Isabella is thriving. She's academically advanced, emotionally healthy, and finally has stability in her life. Your daughter would be proud." "My daughter would want her child to be normal," Victoria hissed. "Not locked away in this house with inappropriate staff who are clearly overstepping their bounds." The implication was clear. Somehow Victoria knew or suspected something about Sophie and Alexander. But how? Before Sophie could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Get out of my house, Victoria." He stood in the doorway, his expression colder than Sophie had ever seen it. Victoria's face drained of color. "Alexander, I heard what you were just doing," he interrupted, moving to stand beside Sophie and Isabella. "Insulting my daughter, disrespecting my staff, and implying that there's something inappropriate happening in my household." "Well, isn't there?" Victoria shot back, recovering her composure. "It's all over the society pages, Alexander. Photos of you coming home early, spending time with the help. People are talking." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. Isabella's well-being is the only thing that matters to me. Not gossip, not your outdated ideas about what's proper, and certainly not your opinion on how I raise my daughter. Catherine would want—" "Don't you dare tell me what Catherine would want," Alexander said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You barely spoke to her the last 5 years of her life because she married me instead of the trust fund baby you picked out. You have no idea what she would want for Isabella." Victoria's face went red. "I'm her grandmother. I have rights." "You have the rights I allow you to have," Alexander interrupted. "And right now you're using them to traumatize my daughter. So I'm asking you one more time. Leave my house." Victoria gathered her designer purse with shaking hands. "You'll regret this, Alexander. I have lawyers. I have influence. If you're behaving inappropriately with staff while caring for my granddaughter, then call your lawyers," Alexander said coldly. "But I promise you, Victoria, if you try to take Isabella from me, you will lose, and you'll never see her again." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Victoria's eyes narrowed, but she apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. She swept out of the room without another word. The moment the front door slammed, Isabella burst into tears. Alexander scooped her up, holding her tight while she sobbed against his shoulder. Sophie stood frozen, her mind racing. Society pages, photos, gossip, their moment in the hallway, their kiss last night. It was supposed to be private, tentative, something they could explore carefully. But if people were already talking, if Victoria was already weaponizing it— "Sophie," Alexander's voice cut through her spiral. Isabella had calmed down, though she still clung to her father. "Can you take Isabella to the classroom? I need to make some calls." Sophie nodded mutely and held out her hand. Isabella transferred to her reluctantly, signing to her father. "Don't send Sophie away. Please don't send her away like the others." Alexander's face crumpled. "Never, baby, I promise. Sophie isn't going anywhere. But as Sophie led Isabella out of the room, she wondered if that was a promise Alexander could keep. In the classroom, Isabella was inconsolable. She threw her books, knocked over a chair, and signed furiously about hating her grandmother, hating being deaf, hating everything. Sophie let her rage, understanding that sometimes children needed to break before they could heal. When Isabella finally exhausted herself, Sophie pulled her into her lap. "Your grandmother is wrong about you," Sophie signed firmly. "You are perfect exactly as you are. Being deaf isn't something broken that needs to be fixed. It's just part of who you are, like having brown hair or being good at math." "But she's right that people talk," Isabella signed back, her small face serious beyond her years. "I heard Daddy on the phone once. People say mean things about him raising me alone. They say I should be in a special school with other deaf kids. They say he's doing it wrong." Sophie's heart broke. "Your daddy loves you more than anything in the world. He's not doing it wrong. He's doing it the best way he knows how, and he's learning and growing every day, just like you are." "Are you and Daddy in love?" Isabella signed suddenly, catching Sophie completely off guard. Sophie's hands froze. "Why would you ask that?" "I see how you look at each other," Isabella signed. "Like in movies, and you make him smile. He never smiled before you came." Sophie struggled to find the right words. "Your daddy and I care about each other, but you are the most important person in both of our lives. Nothing will ever change that." Isabella studied her face intently. Then, "If you and Daddy got married, would you be my real mom?" The question punched the air from Sophie's lungs. "Isabella, we're not, I would like that," Isabella signed, as if Sophie hadn't tried to protest. "Having a mom who understands me, who talks to me for real." Before Sophie could respond, Alexander appeared in the doorway. His face was grim. "Isabella, honey, can you go play in your room for a bit? I need to talk to Sophie." Isabella looked between them, anxiety clear on her face, but she obeyed. When she was gone, Alexander sank into a chair, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "Victoria's lawyers called," he said without preamble. "She's filing for emergency custody, claiming I'm creating an unstable environment for Isabella. She's citing my inappropriate relationship with household staff as evidence of poor judgment." Sophie felt the world tilt. "Alexander, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop," he interrupted. "This isn't your fault. Victoria has been looking for an excuse to take Isabella for years. She thinks money and social status make her a better guardian than I am." He ran his hands through his hair. "But her lawyers are good, and the optics aren't great. A billionaire having a relationship with his child's caregiver. It plays into every stereotype about wealthy men taking advantage of employees." "Then we end it," Sophie said, even though the words felt like swallowing glass. "Right now. We maintain professional boundaries, you fight for custody, and we let Victoria win by making us too afraid to be happy?" Alexander stood up, moving to stand in front of her. "No, I'm not doing that. I'm not letting her threats dictate my life anymore." "But Isabella asked me this morning if you were going to be her new mom," Alexander said quietly. "She said you make me happy, and she wants you to stay forever." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "She asked me the same thing. Then what are we doing, Sophie?" Alexander cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I know this is complicated. I know the timing is terrible, but I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting grief and other people's opinions control my choices." "I'm scared," Sophie whispered. "What if we try this and it falls apart? What if I lose both of you? What if we try this and it works?" Alexander countered. "What if we choose to be brave together?" Sophie thought of Jacob, of his last words to her. "Don't stop living just because I have to." She thought of Isabella, asking if Sophie would be her real mom. She thought of the past 3 years of existing instead of living. "Okay," she said, "let's be brave." Alexander kissed her, and this time it wasn't tentative. It was a declaration, a choice, a leap into the unknown together. They pulled apart at the sound of small feet running. Isabella burst into the room, having obviously been eavesdropping. She threw her arms around both of them, her face radiant with joy. "Family," she signed. "We're a family now." Looking at Alexander over Isabella's head, Sophie realized the child was right. Somehow, unexpectedly, broken pieces had found each other and started to form something whole. But outside the mansion, Victoria Hartwell sat in her car, phone pressed to her ear, speaking to her lawyer. "I want everything you can find on Sophie Mitchell. Every detail, every secret. If there's anything we can use to prove she's an unsuitable influence on my granddaughter, I want to know about it. The battle was just beginning. The custody battle moved swiftly. Within 2 weeks, Victoria's lawyers had filed a formal petition, claiming Alexander was providing an unstable environment for Isabella. The local tabloids picked up the story, spinning it into a sensational narrative. Billionaire's romance with housekeeper sparks custody war. Sophie stopped reading the articles after the third one described her as an opportunistic former maid who seduced her grieving employer. The words stung, not because they were true, but because she knew how they would play in court. Alexander hired the best family law attorney in Seattle, a sharp woman named Margaret Torres, who had a reputation for winning impossible cases. Their first meeting took place in Alexander's home office on a gray Wednesday morning, while Isabella was at a playdate with one of the few children whose parents hadn't been scared off by the media circus. "I'll be direct," Margaret said, spreading documents across the desk. "Victoria's case is weak legally but strong optically. A wealthy grandmother claiming to provide stability versus a billionaire workaholic father who's dating his daughter's caregiver. The judge will care about what's best for Isabella, but public perception influences these cases more than we'd like to admit." "So what do we do?" Alexander asked, his hand finding Sophie's under the table. "We show the judge the truth," Margaret replied. "We document Isabella's progress under Sophie's care. We get Dr. Chen to testify about the educational and emotional improvements. We prove that Sophie isn't some gold digger, but a dedicated professional who has transformed this child's life." She turned to Sophie. "Which means I need to know everything about you. Every detail of your past, your credentials, your relationship with your brother. If there are any skeletons in your closet, Victoria's team will find them. Better I know first." Sophie's stomach churned. There was something she hadn't told anyone, not even Alexander. Something she had buried deep because the shame was too much to bear. "There's something," she said quietly, "about Jacob's death." Alexander's hand tightened around hers. "What about it?" Sophie took a shaky breath. "I told you he died of cancer. That's true. But what I didn't tell you is that in his final weeks, he was in terrible pain. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do, that we should just keep him comfortable. But the morphine wasn't enough. He was suffering so much." Her voice cracked and she had to pause to collect herself. Margaret waited patiently, her expression neutral but attentive. "One night, he begged me to help him end it. He signed it to me over and over. 'Please, Sophie, I can't do this anymore. Please help me go.' I refused at first. I told him we'd find better pain management, that we just needed more time, but he kept asking, kept suffering." "Sophie," Alexander said gently, but she shook her head. "I need to finish this." She looked at Margaret. "I researched it, how much medication it would take. I knew it was illegal, knew I could be prosecuted for assisted suicide, but I couldn't watch him suffer anymore. So one night when the nurses were changing shifts, I prepared a syringe with enough morphine to let him go peacefully." The silence in the room was deafening. Sophie forced herself to continue. "But I couldn't do it. I stood there with the syringe in my hand and I couldn't push the plunger. I was too much of a coward. Jacob saw me crying, saw what I'd been planning to do, and he forgave me. He signed, 'I love you,' and told me it was okay, that he'd hang on a little longer. He died 3 days later, naturally. But those 3 days were the worst of his life, and it's my fault. I could have ended his suffering, but I was too weak." She wiped her eyes roughly. "After he died, there was an investigation. Standard procedure, but the doctors suspected something. They questioned me multiple times about whether I'd helped him die. I told them no, which was technically true, but they knew I was hiding something. Eventually, they dropped it for lack of evidence, but there's a record of the investigation. If Victoria's lawyers dig deep enough, they'll find it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, making notes. "Did anyone else know about this? Did you tell anyone what you'd planned?" "No, just Jacob, and he's gone." "And there's no physical evidence? No witnesses?" "No. The investigation found nothing because there was nothing to find. But the suspicion alone." Sophie trailed off. Alexander pulled her into his arms. She could feel him shaking slightly. "Sophie, I'm so sorry you went through that. The decision you faced, the guilt you've been carrying. It doesn't matter what I've been carrying," Sophie interrupted, pulling away. "What matters is how it looks. Victoria's lawyers will paint me as someone who considered murdering her brother. They'll say I'm dangerous around children, that I have poor judgment, that They'll say a lot of things," Margaret cut in. "But here's what matters. You didn't do it. You made the right choice, even though it was agonizing. That shows moral character, not a lack of it. And the investigation cleared you completely. But the optics, Sophie started. The optics are what we make them, Margaret said firmly. Yes, Victoria's team will try to use this, but we can frame it differently. A young woman facing an impossible situation with her dying brother, showing restraint and respect for the law even in her darkest moment. It could actually work in our favor if we handle it right. Sophie wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at her insides. What if the judge sees it the way Victoria wants them to? What if this costs Alexander custody of Isabella? Then we'll appeal, Alexander said, and we'll keep fighting. But Sophie, you're not leaving. I don't care what Victoria threatens or what the tabloids print. You and Isabella need each other. That's not negotiable. Over the next week, Margaret's team worked around the clock preparing their case. Dr. Chen provided detailed reports showing Isabella's dramatic progress. They compiled videos of Isabella's learning sessions, her artwork, her obvious happiness and engagement. Character witnesses lined up. Mrs. Patterson, Isabella's pediatrician, even some of the previous nannies who admitted they had failed where Sophie had succeeded. But Victoria's team was equally busy. Photographers lurked outside the mansion, capturing photos of Sophie and Alexander together. Tabloids ran stories with headlines like, "From Mop to Mansion, Housekeeper's Fairy Tale," or "Calculated Con." Former colleagues from Sophie's previous jobs were interviewed, most saying nice things, but a few suggesting she had always been ambitious or calculated. The worst came when a tabloid obtained photos from Jacob's funeral. Sophie, gaunt and hollow-eyed, standing alone at the grave. The caption read, "Troubled Past. Sophie Mitchell's history of loss and suspicious circumstances." Sophie stopped leaving the house. The media circus was too much, the judgment too harsh. She focused entirely on Isabella, pouring all her energy into their lessons and activities. But at night, alone in her room, she let herself cry. One evening, Alexander found her on the floor of her suite, surrounded by legal documents and press clippings, tears streaming down her face. "I'm ruining your life," she said when he knelt beside her. "Your reputation, your relationship with Isabella, everything. I should leave. If I'm gone, Victoria won't have ammunition. You can fight for Isabella without this distraction." "You're not a distraction," Alexander said firmly. "You're the reason Isabella is happy. You're the reason I'm happy. Do you really think I'd trade that away because some vultures are printing lies about us?" "They're not all lies," Sophie whispered. "I did consider helping Jacob die. I did fail him. I've been pretending to be stronger than I am, and now everyone can see the truth." Alexander took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "The truth is that you faced an impossible choice and made the hardest decision of your life. The truth is that you've spent 3 years punishing yourself for your brother's death even though it wasn't your fault. The truth is that you're one of the bravest people I've ever met." "I don't feel brave," Sophie said. "Brave people never do." He pulled her close and she let herself collapse against him, finally allowing someone else to carry part of her burden. They stayed like that until Sophie's tears subsided. Then Alexander said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you too, about Catherine's death, about why Victoria really hates me." Sophie pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean?" Alexander's expression was haunted. "The doctors gave us options when Catherine's labor wasn't progressing. Emergency C-section with low risk to both Catherine and the baby, or continue trying for natural birth with higher risk. Victoria wanted the C-section immediately. She demanded it, actually. But Catherine refused. She was terrified of surgery, had this irrational fear of being cut open. She begged me to support her decision to keep trying." He stood up, pacing to the window. "I sided with Catherine. I told the doctors to honor her wishes. And when complications arose and they finally had to do an emergency C-section anyway, it was too late. Catherine hemorrhaged. They couldn't stop the bleeding. She died while I held her hand and told her everything would be okay." His voice broke. "Victoria blames me. She says I killed her daughter by not overruling Catherine's decision, by not forcing the surgery earlier when it might have saved her. And she's right. If I had just insisted, if I had ignored Catherine's wishes and demanded the C-section, my wife would still be alive." Sophie moved to stand beside him. "Or Catherine would be alive and resent you for the rest of your life for violating her bodily autonomy. Or the C-section would have gone wrong anyway. Or 100 other possibilities. You can't know, Alexander. But Victoria knows," he said bitterly. "She knows I chose to respect her daughter's wishes over saving her life. That's why she's fighting so hard for custody. She thinks I'll make the same mistake with Isabella, that my judgment can't be trusted. Sophie understood suddenly why this custody battle was about so much more than who cared for Isabella. It was Victoria's way of punishing Alexander for her daughter's death, of finally having power over the man she blamed for her loss. "We're quite a pair," Sophie said softly, "both carrying guilt for deaths that weren't our fault." Alexander turned to her, and despite everything, he smiled slightly. "Maybe that's why we understand each other so well." The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Margaret prepared them for what to expect. Victoria's lawyers would paint Alexander as an absent workaholic father, and Sophie as an unqualified gold digger with a suspicious past. They would argue that Isabella needed the stability of Victoria's traditional household, with proper schools and social connections. "They're going to come after your relationship hard," Margaret warned. "They'll imply sexual impropriety, abuse of power dynamics, everything they can think of to make it seem inappropriate." "How do we counter that?" Alexander asked. "By being honest," Margaret said. "We acknowledge that yes, you're in a relationship. Yes, Sophie was originally hired as a housekeeper, but we show the timeline, how the relationship only developed after Sophie had already transformed Isabella's life, how it's based on shared values and genuine connection, not exploitation." The morning of the hearing, Sophie woke at 5 a.m. too anxious to sleep. She dressed carefully in the conservative outfit Margaret had selected, a navy blue dress that was professional but not severe, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Alexander knocked on her door at 6:30. He wore a dark suit that made him look every inch the successful businessman, but his eyes were shadowed with worry. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you to know that you've changed our lives, Isabella's and mine. Even if we lose, even if Victoria gets custody, you've given us both something precious. You've reminded us what it means to be a family." Sophie kissed him, trying to pour all her feelings into that one gesture. "We're not going to lose." They drove to the courthouse in Alexander's car, Margaret meeting them outside. A crowd of reporters waited by the entrance, cameras flashing as they hurried inside. Sophie kept her head down, Alexander's hand steady on her back. The courtroom was smaller than Sophie expected, more intimate. Victoria sat on the opposite side with her legal team, looking impeccable in a designer suit. Her eyes found Sophie's, and the hatred in them was palpable. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a stern woman in her 60s with graying hair and sharp eyes. She called the court to order, and Victoria's lead attorney, a man named Richard Sterling, began his opening statement. He painted a picture of Isabella as a vulnerable child being failed by her father's poor judgment. He described Alexander as a man too consumed by work and grief to provide proper care, who had delegated parenting to a string of unsuitable caregivers. And when he got to Sophie, his voice dripped with insinuation. "The court will hear evidence that Ms. Sophie Mitchell was hired as a housekeeper, with no credentials in education or childcare, that she was under investigation for her brother's suspicious death, that she began an inappropriate relationship with her employer while supposedly caring for his vulnerable deaf child. This is not stability, Your Honor. This is chaos masquerading as care." Sophie felt Alexander tense beside her, but Margaret had warned them not to react. They sat stone-faced as Sterling presented his case, calling witnesses who testified about Alexander's long work hours, his emotional distance from Isabella, his history of going through caregivers rapidly. Then Sterling called Victoria herself to the stand. She looked every inch the grieving mother and concerned grandmother as she testified about her daughter's death, about her worries for Isabella's welfare, about the inappropriate environment the child was being raised in. "My granddaughter deserves better than being used as a pawn in her father's midlife crisis," Victoria said, her voice quavering with emotion. "She deserves a stable home, proper education, and caregivers who are qualified professionals, not opportunistic staff members." Margaret's cross-examination was brutal. She got Victoria to admit she had barely visited Isabella in the past 3 years. She established that Victoria's idea of proper education meant sending Isabella to a school that emphasized speech therapy over sign language, effectively trying to force the child to be something she wasn't. "You want Isabella to fit your vision of what a child should be, don't you, Mrs. Hartwell?" Margaret asked. "Even if that means denying who she actually is?" "I want her to have every opportunity," Victoria snapped. "Not to be locked away in that house learning hand gestures from someone with no qualifications." "We'll return to Ms. Mitchell's qualifications in a moment," Margaret said smoothly. "But first, let's discuss your relationship with your daughter, Catherine." Isn't it true that you and Catherine were estranged for the last 5 years of her life? Victoria's face went pale. We had disagreements, but disagreements, Margaret interrupted. Such as when she chose to marry Alexander against your wishes, or when she decided to pursue a career in social work instead of society marriage. Isn't it true that you told your daughter she was making a mistake, that you refused to attend her wedding? That's not relevant, Sterling objected, but Judge Morrison overruled him. Victoria's composure cracked. My daughter made choices I didn't agree with, but I loved her. Yet you're now trying to take custody of her child from the man she chose to marry, Margaret said. The man she loved and trusted to raise their daughter. Isn't this really about punishing Alexander for Catherine's death? About finally having power over the man you blame for your loss? Objection, Sterling shouted, but the damage was done. Victoria was crying, her careful mask shattered. The judge called for a recess. In the hallway, Margaret looked grimly satisfied. That went well, she said, but the hard part is coming. They're going to call you to the stand after lunch, Sophie. Are you ready? Sophie nodded, though she felt like she might throw up. The afternoon session began with Sterling calling Sophie to testify. She walked to the stand on shaking legs, her palms sweating as she was sworn in. Sterling wasted no time going for the throat. He established her background as a housekeeper, her lack of formal credentials in education or childcare, her brother's death and the subsequent investigation. He made it all sound sinister, calculated, suspicious. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you researched how to administer a lethal dose of morphine to your brother? He asked. Yes, Sophie said quietly. Jacob was in terrible pain. He begged me to help him die. I was desperate to ease his suffering, so I researched it, but I didn't go through with it. Because you were caught? No, because it was wrong. Because even though my brother was suffering, I couldn't take his life. That wasn't my choice to make. Sterling paced in front of her. And yet, within months of this traumatic incident, you took a job as a housekeeper in the home of a billionaire with a young deaf child. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? It wasn't a coincidence. It was a job, Sophie said. I needed work, and housekeeping was something I could do without having to interact with people much. I was still grieving. And when did you decide to seduce your employer? Objection. Margaret was on her feet. Counsel is testifying, not asking questions. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Rephrase, Mr. Sterling. Sterling smiled coldly. When did your relationship with Alexander Hartwell become romantic? Sophie took a breath, remembering Margaret's coaching. Tell the truth. Be honest. Let them see who you really are. It wasn't something I decided or planned, she said. I met Isabella by chance when she was crying in the garden. I signed to her because it was instinctive, because I knew what it felt like to be isolated and misunderstood. Over the following weeks, as I worked with her, Alexander and I developed a friendship based on our shared love for Isabella and our shared experiences with grief. The romantic feelings came later, naturally, and neither of us acted on them until we were certain it wouldn't harm Isabella. How convenient, Sterling said. A former housekeeper, with no prospects and crushing student loan debt, develops natural feelings for a billionaire. You'll forgive me if I'm skeptical. Sophie felt anger flash through her, burning away the fear. I don't need you to believe me, Mr. Sterling. I need Isabella to believe me. And she does, because unlike every expensive professional her father hired before me, I actually see her, not as a problem or a project, but as a brilliant, loving child who happens to be deaf. I love that little girl. I would do anything for her, including walk away from Alexander if that's what was best for her. But it's not. What's best for Isabella is having a father who's learning to be present and a support system that values her for exactly who she is. The courtroom was silent. Sterling looked like he wanted to continue, but seemed to recognize he'd lost this round. No further questions. Margaret's redirect was brief. She had Sophie explain her credentials, not formal degrees, but lived experience as a deaf person's sibling, fluency in ASL, years of navigating the world alongside someone who communicated differently. She had Sophie describe Isabella's progress, her personality, her dreams and fears. By the time Sophie left the stand, several people in the gallery were wiping their eyes. The judge called Dr. Chen next, whose testimony was clinical but devastating to Victoria's case. Isabella had made more progress in 2 months with Sophie than in the previous 2 years with expensive specialists. Her emotional health had improved dramatically. She was thriving in ways that were measurable and documented. Finally, Margaret called Alexander to the stand. He admitted his mistakes, the long work hours, the emotional distance, his failures as a father after Catherine's death. But he also described how Sophie had helped him reconnect with his daughter, how he was learning sign language, how he had cut his work hours nearly in half to be more present. "I'm not a perfect father," Alexander said, looking directly at Judge Morrison. "But I love my daughter more than anything in this world, and I finally found a way to show her that thanks to Sophie. If the court takes Isabella from me, you'll be punishing my daughter for my past mistakes instead of recognizing how far we've both come." Victoria's team tried to cross-examine him, to paint him as an unfit parent, but Alexander held firm. He was calm, honest, and unshakable in his love for his daughter. The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Sterling argued for stability and traditional values. Margaret argued for progress and love. Judge Morrison said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed again, shouting questions. Sophie kept her head down, but Alexander stopped. "I'll make one statement," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Isabella Hartwell is a bright, beautiful, talented child who happens to be deaf. She deserves caregivers who see her potential, not her limitations. Ms. Mitchell has given her that gift, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for it. That's all." In the car driving home, Sophie finally let herself breathe. "Do you think we won?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "But we told the truth, that's all we can do." When they arrived home, Mrs. Patterson met them at the door, her face grave. "Mr. Hartwell, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent. She's waiting in the library." Sophie and Alexander exchanged confused glances and headed to the library. A woman stood by the window, her back to them. When she turned, Sophie gasped. The woman was in her late 60s, with Sophie's same brown hair now streaked with gray, and Jacob's eyes. "Hello, Sophie," the woman said. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, but when I saw the news, I knew I had to tell the truth." "Mom?" Sophie whispered, shock and confusion warring in her chest. "What are you doing here?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm here to save you, to tell the court what really happened the night Jacob died." Sophie's blood ran cold. "Mom, no, don't." "It was me, Sophie," her mother said, her voice breaking. "I'm the one who gave Jacob the morphine, not you." The confession hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate, and Sophie knew that everything was about to change again. The library fell into stunned silence. Sophie stared at her mother, Linda Mitchell, the woman she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. The last time they'd spoken, it had been a screaming match over the phone about Sophie abandoning the family by moving to Seattle after Jacob's death. "What are you talking about?" Sophie finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda moved closer, her hands trembling. She looked older than Sophie remembered, frailer. The guilt had clearly been eating her alive. "The night Jacob died, you weren't the only one who couldn't bear watching him suffer. After you left his room, after you couldn't go through with it, I went in. He was sleeping fitfully, moaning even in his sleep. The pain was eating him alive." She wiped tears from her weathered face. "I sat with him, and when he woke up, he signed to me. He said, 'Sophie tried to be brave for me, but she couldn't. She loves me too much. But Mom, you're strong enough. Please. I can't do this anymore.' And her voice broke completely. I was strong enough, or weak enough. I don't even know anymore." Alexander moved to Sophie's side, his presence grounding her as her world tilted. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you saying you administered the morphine that ended your son's life?" "Yes," Linda said simply. "I calculated the dose, just like Sophie had researched. I gave it to him through his IV. He signed 'Thank you' and 'I love you' to me. Then he closed his eyes and went to sleep, peacefully, finally without pain. He died 20 minutes later." Sophie felt her knees give out. Alexander caught her, guiding her to a chair. "You let me think it was my fault," she said, her voice hollow. "For 3 years I've been carrying the guilt of planning to kill my own brother, and you never said anything." "I know," Linda whispered. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. When the investigation started, I was terrified. I thought they'd arrest me, that I'd go to prison for murder. So I let them focus on you instead. I let you take the suspicion, the interviews, the judgment. I told myself I was protecting our family, but really I was just a coward." She sank into a chair, looking a decade older. "But then I saw the news coverage of your custody hearing. I saw that woman trying to paint you as some kind of murderer, trying to use Jacob's death to destroy your life, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. You've suffered enough for my choices." Sophie's mind was reeling. 3 years of guilt, of nightmares, of wondering if she was a monster for even considering ending Jacob's suffering, and it had all been based on a lie. Not her lie, but her mother's. "Why now?" Sophie asked, her voice hard. "Why not 2 years ago when I was drowning in grief? Why not last year when I could barely get out of bed? Why wait until my life was finally coming together to blow it all apart?" Linda flinched at the anger in Sophie's voice. "Because I'm a coward, because I was afraid, because I told myself you were strong enough to handle it, that you'd moved on. But seeing you in those courtroom photos, seeing how happy you looked with that little girl," she gestured at a newspaper on the table, showing a photo of Sophie and Isabella from outside the mansion. "I realized you'd built a new life, a good life, and I couldn't let my silence destroy it." Alexander spoke up, his voice measured. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you understand what you're saying? If you testify to this in court, you could face criminal charges. Assisted suicide is illegal in most circumstances." "I know," Linda said. "I've already spoken with an attorney. The statute of limitations hasn't expired, but given the circumstances, terminal cancer, documented pain, Jacob's repeated requests, my lawyer thinks I'll likely face minimal charges, if any, probably probation and community service at worst." She looked at Sophie with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come. It's time I stopped being a coward." Sophie stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the gardens were in bloom, roses and lavender creating splashes of color against the green. She thought about Isabella, about the little girl who had brought her back to life, about Alexander who had shown her it was possible to love again, about the family they were building together. And she thought about Jacob, about his final days, about the impossible choice her mother had faced. "Did he really ask you to do it?" Sophie asked without turning around. "Or are you just saying that to make me feel better?" "He asked," Linda said firmly, "multiple times over those last days. He made me promise not to tell you, said he couldn't bear to put that weight on you twice. He knew you'd tried and couldn't go through with it. He said you were too good, too pure-hearted. He needed someone who loved him enough to do the terrible thing." Sophie turned back to face her mother. "I've hated you for 2 years. For how you treated me after Jacob died. For blaming me for leaving Arizona, for making me feel like I'd abandoned the family. And now I find out you were carrying this secret the whole time." "I know," Linda whispered, "and you have every right to hate me forever. But Sophie, please let me do this one thing right. Let me tell the truth in court. Let me clear your name." Before Sophie could respond, Margaret Torres appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Patterson must have called her. The attorney assessed the situation quickly, her sharp eyes moving from Sophie to Linda to Alexander. "I'm going to need to hear everything," Margaret said, moving into the room with purpose. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'll need a detailed statement. Dates, times, witnesses, everything. If we're going to use this in court, it needs to be airtight." Over the next 2 hours, Linda gave her statement. Margaret recorded everything, asking probing questions, ensuring there were no holes in the narrative. Alexander stayed close to Sophie, his hand a constant presence on her shoulder or back, anchoring her through the surreal revelations. When it was finished, Margaret sat back, her expression unreadable. This changes everything. Victoria's team was building their case around Sophie's supposed moral failings, suggesting she was dangerous around children because of the investigation into Jacob's death. But if Linda testifies that she was the one who administered the morphine, their entire narrative collapses. "But won't this make things worse?" Sophie asked. "Now there's proof that someone in my family actually did commit assisted suicide. Won't Victoria's lawyers use that against us?" Margaret shook her head. "They'll try, but it won't work the same way. You were investigated and cleared. You're not responsible for your mother's actions." And honestly, Linda's decision to come forward and face potential prosecution shows moral courage. It demonstrates that your family values truth and accountability, even when it's difficult. She turned to Linda. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to be clear about something. If you testify to this, the prosecutor could decide to file charges against you. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Linda nodded without hesitation. "I'm certain. I should have done it 3 years ago." Margaret made several phone calls, arranging an emergency motion to reopen testimony. Judge Morrison agreed to hear Linda's statement the following day. That night, Sophie barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing 3 years of false guilt and the complicated emotions swirling through her. Around midnight, she heard a soft knock on her door. Alexander stood in the hallway, looking as sleepless as she felt. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Sophie shook her head. He came in and sat beside her on the bed, not touching, just present. "I keep thinking about Jacob," Sophie said quietly. "About how much pain he must have been in to ask my mother to do that. About how I failed him by not being strong enough." "You didn't fail him," Alexander said firmly. "You loved him enough to stay with him until the end, to respect his autonomy while also respecting the law and your own moral boundaries. That's not failure, Sophie. That's impossible, beautiful love." Sophie felt tears sliding down her face. "I've been so angry at my mother for so long. For how she treated me after he died, for pushing me away, for making me feel like I'd betrayed the family. And now I understand she was drowning in her own guilt, lashing out because she couldn't face what she'd done. Understanding doesn't mean you have to forgive her immediately," Alexander said. "You're allowed to be angry and hurt and confused all at once." "I know," Sophie whispered, "but part of me is also grateful. She gave Jacob what I couldn't, peace at the end, even if it meant sacrificing her own peace for years afterward." Alexander pulled her close, and Sophie let herself cry against his shoulder. For Jacob, for her mother, for 3 years of unnecessary guilt, and for the family she was building with this man and his daughter. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had leaked about Linda's testimony, and media interest had reached fever pitch. Sophie sat between Alexander and Margaret, her mother on the other side, as Judge Morrison called the court to order. Victoria's legal team immediately objected to reopening testimony, but Judge Morrison overruled them. "This court is interested in the truth, Mr. Sterling. If there is new evidence relevant to Ms. Mitchell's character and fitness to care for Isabella Hartwell, I will hear it." Linda took the stand, looking small but determined. Under Margaret's gentle questioning, she told the entire story. Jacob's cancer, his suffering, his repeated requests for help dying, Sophie's inability to go through with it, and finally Linda's decision to grant her son's final wish. The courtroom was utterly silent as she spoke. Several people were crying openly. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret asked, "why didn't you come forward 3 years ago during the investigation?" "Because I was afraid," Linda said simply. "Afraid of prison, of losing my other children, of being labeled a murderer. So I let my daughter carry suspicion that should have been mine. It's the worst thing I've ever done, worse even than helping Jacob die, because that was an act of love, however misguided. But letting Sophie suffer for my choice? That was pure cowardice." Sterling's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective. He tried to paint Linda as a murderer, Sophie as coming from a family of criminals, but every attack only highlighted the impossible situation Jacob's terminal illness had created. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sterling asked, "do you expect this court to believe that you committed what amounts to murder out of love?" Linda met his eyes steadily. "I don't expect you to believe anything, Mr. Sterling. I'm simply telling you what happened. My son was dying in agony, begging for release. I gave him that release, knowing I might face prison for it. If that makes me a murderer in your eyes, so be it. But I can live with that label. What I couldn't live with anymore was watching my daughter suffer for my choices." When Linda stepped down, Judge Morrison called for a brief recess. In the hallway, Sophie finally faced her mother. "Why?" Sophie asked. "Really, why? It can't just be the news coverage." Linda touched Sophie's face gently, the first motherly gesture she'd shown in years. "Because when Jacob was dying, he made me promise something else. He made me promise to take care of you, to not let you destroy yourself with guilt. I broke that promise for 3 years. I couldn't break it anymore." "Break?" Sophie felt something crack open in her chest, the anger and resentment she'd been carrying for so long beginning to drain away. "I don't know if I can forgive you right away, but I want to try. That's all I can ask for," Linda whispered. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Sterling tried to salvage his case, but the wind had gone out of his sails. Margaret's closing was simple and powerful. "Your Honor, this case boils down to a simple question. What's best for Isabella Hartwell? The evidence shows clearly that Isabella is thriving under her current care. She's academically advanced, emotionally healthy, and finally has the support system that allows her to flourish as the brilliant child she is. Victoria Hartwell wants to take Isabella away, not because the child is being harmed, but because she disapproves of her son-in-law's choices. That's not grounds for removing a child from a loving home." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "I'll take all of this under advisement, but given the new testimony and the serious nature of the allegations, I'm prepared to issue a preliminary ruling today." The courtroom held its collective breath. "Having reviewed all the evidence and testimony," Judge Morrison said, I find that Isabella Hartwell is receiving excellent care in her father's home. Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated exceptional skill and dedication in supporting Isabella's development. While Victoria Hartwell's concerns about stability are understandable, they are not sufficient to overcome the clear evidence that Isabella is thriving in her current situation. Sophie felt Alexander's hand grip hers tightly. Therefore, I am denying Victoria Hartwell's petition for custody. Alexander Hartwell will retain full custody of his daughter. However, I am ordering regular evaluations by a court-appointed child psychologist to ensure Isabella's continued well-being, and I encourage Victoria Hartwell to establish a more constructive relationship with her granddaughter through supervised visitation. The gavel came down and the courtroom erupted. Victoria was crying, her lawyers scrambling to console her. Alexander pulled Sophie into his arms and she felt tears of relief streaming down her face. They had won. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded them, but Alexander only gave a brief statement. We are grateful for the court's decision and look forward to continuing to provide Isabella with the love and support she deserves. That's all. At home, Mrs. Patterson had prepared a celebration dinner. Isabella, who had been staying with Dr. Chen during the hearing, was waiting for them in the foyer. She took one look at their faces and signed frantically. We won? I get to stay home? You get to stay home. Sophie signed back, kneeling to embrace the little girl, forever and always. Isabella threw her arms around both Sophie and Alexander, and they stood there in the grand foyer, the three of them wrapped in a tangle of arms and tears and joy. Later that evening, after Isabella was asleep and the celebration had wound down, Sophie found herself in the garden where she'd first met the little girl. The roses were in full bloom now, their scent heavy in the cool night air. Alexander found her there just as she'd known he would. Quite a day, he said, settling beside her on the stone bench. Quite a few months, Sophie corrected with a small smile. I came here as a housekeeper trying to hide from life, and now you're the woman who saved my daughter, Alexander finished. The woman who brought our family back to life. The woman I'm completely in love with. Sophie's breath caught. They hadn't said those words yet, both too scared, too scarred by past losses. I love you too, she whispered. Both of you. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, but you and Isabella. You've given me a reason to be brave. Alexander kissed her, soft and tender, and full of promise. When they broke apart, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I know this is fast, he said, opening it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. And I know we still have a lot to figure out. But Sophie Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you be Isabella's mother and my partner and my love for the rest of our lives? Sophie looked at the ring, then at Alexander's face, then back toward the house where Isabella slept peacefully. She thought about Jacob, about how he'd told her not to stop living. She thought about 3 years of existing in shadows, and the past few months of finally stepping back into the light. Yes, she said, her voice strong and sure. Yes, I'll marry you. Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, and they sat together in the garden as the stars came out overhead. Two broken people who had found each other, who had chosen to be brave together, who had built a family from the ashes of their losses. Inside the house, Isabella stirred in her sleep, dreaming of a future where she had a mother who understood her, a father who was learning her language, and a family that was finally, truly whole. The next morning, Sophie woke to find Isabella standing beside her bed, signing excitedly. You're wearing a ring. Does this mean you're going to be my real mom now? Sophie signed back, her heart full to bursting. I'm going to be your real mom, if that's okay with you? Isabella launched herself onto the bed, wrapping her arms around Sophie. It's more than okay. It's perfect. We're going to be a real family. Alexander appeared in the doorway, watching them with undisguised love. Shall we tell her the other news? He signed to Sophie. Sophie nodded, and together they signed to Isabella. We're going to have a real wedding, and you get to be the flower girl. And then we're all going to be a family officially. Isabella's joy was radiant. She bounced on the bed, signing so fast her hands blurred. Can I help pick the flowers? Can I wear a fancy dress? Can we have cake? Yes to all of it, Sophie signed, laughing. As the three of them sat there making wedding plans in sign language, Mrs. Patterson appeared with breakfast on a tray. She took one look at the scene, Alexander and Sophie on the bed with Isabella between them, all of them signing and laughing, and her eyes filled with happy tears. Finally, she said, finally this house feels like a home again. Over the following months, life settled into a new rhythm. Linda Mitchell faced a hearing regarding Jacob's death, but as her lawyer predicted, The prosecutor declined to file charges, citing the extraordinary circumstances and the time elapsed. She moved to Seattle to be closer to Sophie, and slowly, tentatively, they began rebuilding their relationship. Victoria Hartwell eventually reached out through lawyers, requesting supervised visitation with Isabella. After much discussion, Alexander and Sophie agreed to limited visits, with Dr. Chen present. The first few were awkward, but gradually, Victoria began to see Isabella for who she really was, not who Victoria thought she should be. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it was progress. The wedding took place in the mansion's gardens on a perfect September afternoon. Isabella did indeed wear a fancy dress and carry flowers, signing "beautiful" to everyone who would watch. Linda walked Sophie down the aisle, both of them crying. Dr. Chen officiated, incorporating both spoken vows and signed vows so everyone could participate. When Alexander and Sophie exchanged rings, Isabella stood between them, her hands joining theirs, making them a circle of three. "Family," Isabella signed, "forever family." 6 months after the wedding, Sophie officially adopted Isabella. The courtroom ceremony was small and private, but when the judge pronounced Isabella Hartwell Mitchell as Sophie's legal daughter, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That night, tucking Isabella into bed, Sophie found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. 3 years ago, she had been drowning in grief, convinced she would never feel whole again. Now she had a daughter, a husband, a purpose, and a future that blazed bright with possibility. "Mama Sophie?" Isabella signed. She had taken to calling Sophie Mama Sophie and Alexander Daddy to distinguish between them. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Uncle Jacob would be happy about our family?" Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. "I think he'd be overjoyed. He always wanted me to be happy. I wish I could have met him," Isabella signed wistfully. "To thank him." "Thank him for what?" "For teaching you sign language," Isabella signed. "If he hadn't been deaf, you wouldn't have learned to sign. And if you didn't know sign language, you would have walked past me crying that day in the garden, and we never would have become a family. So Uncle Jacob gave me a mama, even though he never met me." Sophie pulled her daughter close, too moved to sign. Isabella was right. Jacob's legacy wasn't just pain and loss. It was this: the ability to connect, to communicate, to build bridges across silence. He had given Sophie the tools she needed to find her family, even though he never got to meet them. "I love you so much," Sophie finally signed. "I love you too, Mama Sophie," Isabella signed back. "Forever and always." After Isabella fell asleep, Sophie found Alexander in his office reviewing contracts. But when she entered, he immediately set his work aside, pulling her into his arms. "Our daughter is wise beyond her years," Sophie said, recounting Isabella's observation about Jacob. Alexander held her tighter. "She gets that from you. You taught her to find meaning in pain, to look for the gifts hidden in loss." "We taught her together," Sophie corrected. "This family, this life we've built, it's all of us. Our broken pieces fitting together into something whole." They stood there in comfortable silence, two people who had survived unimaginable loss and found their way back to hope. Outside, Seattle's rain began to fall, but inside the mansion, warmth and light and love glowed in every room. Sophie thought about the shy housekeeper she had been, the woman who had made herself invisible to avoid pain. She thought about the moment she had chosen to be brave, to sit with a crying child in the rain, to speak with hands instead of words. That single choice had changed everything. And as she stood in her husband's arms, in the home they had built together with their daughter sleeping peacefully down the hall, Sophie finally understood what Jacob had meant when he told her not to stop living. This was living, this messy, beautiful, terrifying, perfect life. This was what it meant to choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, love over loss. This was what it meant to finally come home.